What's up, everybody? Welcome to Podcast Now. I'm Alex, and in this video, I want to talk about Thomas Zane in Alan Wake 2. I want to do a couple of these theory videos over the next few weeks. We are fast approaching Alan Wake 2, and I've gone deep into the rabbit hole of the lore and the story. I had played the first game actually quite a few times at this point, but I wanted to look at some explanations of the story and all sorts of things just to get ready, just to kind of brace myself, because Remedy goes hard for the lore and just all the details in these games, and I just want to be ready when it comes to Alan Wake 2. So I thought we would start with one of the most interesting, if not maybe the most interesting characters in all of Alan Wake, and it's somebody that I want to talk a little bit about Thomas Zane's history in this video, but I also want to talk a little bit about, like, what are they going to do with him in the second game. And it all revolves, in my opinion, around kind of one thing. Who is he? Who is this guy? Now, you can get kind of complex with it. To boil it down, is he Alan Wake? Did one actually create the other, or vice versa? Or is it some sort of third random option? So playing the game, you kind of get at least I did, you kind of get the impression that Thomas Zane originally kind of creates Alan Wake. I feel like that's how they built the game up. Now, as the game goes on, I feel like they kind of throw it at you that, well, maybe it was the other way around, because considering Alan is writing his way through, like, the entire thing, right? And it's kind of like a story within a story. Because of that complexity, and it's kind of like the chicken or the egg dilemma where you can keep going around in circles of, like, which one came first. Because this game, I think, has a lot of the same issues, but it's kind of like cool issues. It's not like a bad thing. You wonder, okay, well, originally it seems like Thomas Zane set Alan Wake off on this quest to defeat the darkness and gave him the clicker and all that kind of, right? Like, Thomas Zane kind of put that stuff forward. But then you wonder, well, did Alan write that kind of, like, who's to say that Alan didn't make up the character of Thomas Zane, who had that fascinating background? Now, I believe the way it's pitched and the way that it seemingly goes, Thomas Zane kind of came first. So the chicken or the egg approach, I think Thomas Zane is real. And if I were to go with my gut tells me they're actually the same person. Now, I guess what I would fall back on, if that theory is wrong, is Thomas Zane came first, and then I guess I'd have to just decide on who wrote who. I'd want to say Thomas Zane wrote Alan Wake, just because of the way the story goes. So in case you're kind of catching up here, remember, Thomas Zane kind of set the entire thing up. His wife, Barbara, right, drowns, and he writes himself and her out of existence. We have the whole stabbing through the heart kind of thing, or taking out the heart, all of that jazz. But the general idea that he had this connection to the dark place and the dark presence first, takes everything out of existence, takes himself, and writes Alan Wake kind of, not necessarily into existence. See, there's that little, like, cliff, too, where it's like, does he create Alan Wake, or is Alan Wake already a person, and he kind of writes Alan Wake on the path to be able to do the thing? Because it kind of feels like it's that. Kind of feels like Alan Wake was already a living, and I think people have debated this for a long time, by the way, that Alan Wake was a child, existed, and then Thomas Zane kind of wrote into his backstory. He's afraid of the dark, all the stuff with him as a young kid, and then as he grows up, he's going to kind of be the savior, the one to kind of banish it all. And like, there's that entire arc. And I feel like that's pretty powerful. I think that's kind of right. But then you have the dilemma with all they've done, I guess, really past Alan Wake, like with DLC or when it comes to Control. The thing that gets me, I guess, on the path that Thomas Zane and Alan Wake could be the same person is really two different things. Number one, the confusion of who Thomas Zane even is, right? So, like, a lot of the people don't know who he is. Obviously, he's approached to, or like how he kind of starts everything is as a poet, but then you kind of learn later, especially in Control, well, was he a filmmaker? So now he's a filmmaker and a poet. Then there were stories of, like, he looks like Alan Wake, like people kind of get them. It's like, okay, well, you have that. And then the final part, I guess, is in Control, Control's DLC, I suppose, you have Thomas Zane talking to Alan Wake, right? Talking in the same room, and they're looking exactly alike. And he's asked about his diver suit, right? Which is an important thing to throw out. Technically, the diver in Alan Wake is not Thomas Zane. It is the bright, I guess, side of the light and darkness. Very Kingdom Hearts-like, by the way. I just want to throw that out there. But that's not technically Thomas Zane. But then you're told, well, that was just, I guess, a role from his past, right? That was basically a film role that he did. It's tough. It's really, really tough. But I've seen theory videos where people have kind of broken down actually some of the clips that they've shown of Alan Wake 2 of what seems like a filmmaker, a person like holding a camera, and then the camera disappears and he's holding like his hand out. And it's like, well, is that Thomas Zane? Because obviously he doesn't look like Alan Wake. To me, honestly, like, I'm fascinated by Mr. Scratch, like how he's still around and what he's doing, and obviously the whole, or a big part of Alan Wake 2, I don't know if it's the whole game, Alan getting out of the dark place and all that. Like, those are huge things, and those are going to be some of the biggest like hang-ups that the game is going to have to figure out. But for me, it might come down to Thomas Zane as like the biggest thing the game has to answer. Who is the guy? Who came first? If one created the other, who did that? Is one, I guess, more important in that way? Are they the same person? And that's kind of like the epiphany at the end of the game where it's like, well, it's not that Alan wrote Tom, or maybe it is. Like, I guess you'd have to also decide like who was the base one then. And I think the answer to that would be Alan, that Alan Wake wrote Thomas Zane into existence, who then wrote Alan. But because Alan wrote Thomas Zane first, then technically he started first, Alan Wake. So it's very, like, see how it just kind of circles in a spiral that never ends? I love that stuff. Alex from the future here. My wife just wanted to throw something in or have me say it for her. She believes that Thomas Zane is actually Alan Wake's dad. I guess she found people online, a support group that has backed up that claim. You know what? That's a good theory. I wanted to throw it in this video. I'm going to say I don't fully go for it. I actually like my ideas better. It's also so that I can be right and she can be wrong, but I wanted to throw it into this video. I get really fascinated with what they can do with Thomas Zane, and also just kind of being like this guardian angel. I mean, technically, almost symbolically, right? This guardian angel who kind of like works in the background. He has answers. He tries to help even when Alan doesn't really want him to help. Just the role that Thomas so far has played, and what you do with him after Alan has been stuck in the dark place for 13 freaking years. And even if he gets out, well, what happens? And does Thomas Zane still kind of like talk to him and all of this stuff? Like, where are they going? And then technically, in the dark place, isn't there also a mini world where Barbara and Thomas Zane are living, like the actual humans are living happily ever after? Isn't that in the dark place somewhere? So like, could Alan ever find that? Does Alan find that in the second game? There's so many questions, and I think Thomas Zane is kind of at the center of a lot of them. But I could see it getting, not like philosophical, but I could see it really getting kind of deep as to the who created who, and are they just the same person, and what does that mean for them? And I think that is important in terms of like Alan, where how much do we care about his internal struggle? Because if he's not even real, if he was just kind of like most of his story was written by somebody else, I feel like you almost care less. So like, I feel like they got to answer that. They got to explain almost who's more important or who set who off, even though the way they've already told it, at least right now, is Thomas Zane kind of started the whole thing. But do they retcon that in a Remedy-like way? It's really interesting. So you let me know what your theories are in the comments. I can't wait. I can't wait for this freaking game. Again, this is the first of many theory videos I want to make on Alan Wake. We might do some sort of like story recap or other things as we get closer to the second game, but we got videos coming. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you all on the next one.